All right, welcome to American Spirits episode 11, where we are covering Carl Schmitt's essay, The Concept of the Political. Welcome, Mr. Auberon Quinn and Mr. Ryan Turnipseed again to our 11th episode. How are you guys doing?
Pretty good.
I forgive me. I am as ever grateful for the distinction of being asked to appear on this program.
Excellent. Yes, and of course, Mr. Turnipseed. It was his idea to cover the concept of the political, and I think that was very pertinent as Carl Schmitt is being referenced everywhere in the last 2 weeks, and Carl Schmitt is often misreferenced, which I think has a lot to do with why Ryan wanted to cover this essay in particular. The concept of the political is really his critical essay. It was published in what 1929 or something like that. Obviously, Carl Schmitt is German. You can look up the publication date if you want. I'm not going to scroll all the way to the beginning of this PDF because I have it marked where I want to read from. Anyway, Ryan, why is it okay to cover this German man on American Spirits? What is going on here?
So I would like to answer that question in two ways. The first and most practical one is just that a whole bunch of other Americans right now in politics, the media, commentary, and whatever else are talking about Carl Schmitt. So regardless of his origins or not, it is relevant to Americans who Carl Schmitt is because a very powerful force in society right now, especially in the more right-wing media sphere, is talking about him. So it's just practically relevant. You can try to ignore him at this point, and you would fail. He has detractors now, despite the fact that his work is almost a century old. So if you have elements of the American left talking about the evil force that is Carl Schmitt, he is most certainly not absent from our considerations. That's the practical side. On the theoretical side, and this is going to be part of perhaps what we correct. Carl Schmitt, throughout most, if not all, of the essay, is being purely descriptive. So, despite the fact he is German, this is written in German, and whatnot else, he had political views that are just entirely foreign to the United States. Not to comment on them, just the fact that they're entirely removed from anything that we're doing. It's entirely irrelevant because most of this essay or book is just descriptive. He is describing what is. That will become relevant later because, as Charlemagne, you said that he's often misquoted. This is perhaps the biggest one of which he has misquoted. People take Carl Schmitt's writings here to be an is or a prescription. You need to do this. You should be doing this, when in actuality he's talking about this is what happens. Whether you like it or not, love it, hate it, try to work against it or work with it, whatever. This is just how things are. So it's reality, number one, and number two, it's important in the political moment. So that's why we're covering it.
You might even describe it as a value-free analysis. And you're right, Ryan. It is very important to cover this, especially in this particular moment, because of the clarity with which he lies out the underlying dynamics of human nature, which give rise to the political as a concept.
Yes, and given especially in relation to some of the things we've covered on the stream, like the period of the Articles of the Confederation, you simply cannot really comprehend anything related to politics without reading Carl Schmitt, frankly, because his description, his definition of politics, which is the key contribution in this particular essay, which was published in 1932. I just checked the concept of the political, where he actually defines what the political actually is, which might seem sort of like a trite thing to do, but it's actually quite difficult. And his ability to define it in absolutely concise and clear terms, which are in fact what the friend enemy distinction actually is. I'll give it to Ryan in a sec. Go ahead.
It is both revealing and amazing that it took basically 2,500 years before anyone even really. I mean, Aristotle does go into it a bit in the politics, the political, having to do with the polis, but in terms of the phenomenon of human behavior that is politics. Schmidt nails it, and it's amazing both the brilliance of his doing so and the fact that no one really tried before him.
Yes, and that friend enemy distinction you've heard so much about. We will talk about what that is today. That really is what the political is. It is defined by that distinction, and we'll get to that shortly. I will read a significant portion of the second chapter uh, as we get into it. But Ryan, did you have anything you wanted to preface with before I start reading from chapter 2?
Right. So this is just laying out the first part. The first chapter in very early to mid 20th century German fashion is very ethereal. It's kind of difficult to find a specific hard point that's being made. But there's a lot that's important that can be generally paraphrased. Um, Something that's important to understand about Schmidt is that he is his specialty or his focus is in state theory or the theory of the state. He has a very interesting essay or a rather exposition of Thomas Hobbes's state theory that is a philosopher that he often defaults back to. I don't like a lot of the conclusions that he reaches during that, but that's much more of a comparison of ideas as compared to this essay that we're covering now, which is just a description of what politics is, what the state is, and whatnot else. So, the state and the political are two concepts that Schmidt will invoke throughout this book or this essay. The state is not directly defined. He does not do the thing that the English-speaking world loves to do, where he has a word, hyphen, and then the definition, which is unfortunate. But he does start out with a statement that the state and the political are fundamentally intertwined. And as we get into what the political entails, just as a very basic idea, the political is a sort of an existential conflict between groups that so far has not resorted just to complete warfare, though that can be resorted to. This is fundamentally the topic or the domain which the state is interested in. The state is results from politics and engages in politics, and is the tendency of the state to sort of monopolize the political sphere. That is especially the history of the last 2 or 3 centuries. So that's an important preface that I think we should perhaps understand. What are these words meaning? This is in contrast, and this is kind of what Schmidt is writing against. This is in contrast to the colloquial idea of political meaning like a negative or having a negative connotation. That's a political issue. This is just politics. This is not religion. This is politics, something like that. Schmidt's writing against this more colloquial and denigrated usage of the word, and is just pointing out that actually wherever there are groups in conflict, there is politics. So this I thought would be an important thing to state at the outset.
Excellent. And the state figures so strongly in this particular essay because the state is that which defines friends and enemies with no contest in, let's say, stable times. Enemies in that case would be foreign states in most cases. In some cases, perhaps domestic subversives or radicals. In other times, especially times approaching civil war, the state will lose or weaken in that ability to define friends and enemies, and other groups, other political groups aside from the state, when the state is weakened, will make those determinations as well. But in most cases, the state is the primary determiner of who is friend and who is enemy.
Right, and this is also something that's important to keep in mind. This is not referencing what most Americans, especially on the right, would recognize it as the state, which is just this territorial monopoly on such and such industries, control, power, and whatnot else necessarily. At least that's not what Schmidt explicitly says. Rather, what Schmidt talks about is that it's just the organization of a group in a specific territory. So that's on a more academic level. Schmidt was an academic, so if you can bear with me here, when most Americans, especially, I think, hear the word state, they think about a bureaucracy or something else. This does not necessarily have to be the case for Schmidt. If you are in, say, a power vacuum and a group gets together to establish defense or whatnot else, they are now a state in that area. This is perhaps the first and one of the more important missteps that I see people commit whenever they talk about these theories, especially of the state, talking about just descriptive politics. The same thing happens in elite theory and whatnot else, where we sort of appropriate more modern colloquial usages of these words, import them into the things that we read, and then we misunderstand what he's talking about. So for Schmidt, the state is not necessarily a modern phenomenon. He draws from more modern theories, but in the way that he uses it and defines it, and as we'll talk about, the way that it gets applied out of the value-free analysis, the state is not necessarily the modern form. It's just the political organization of a group in a specific area.
Excellent. Now that we have established those clarifying statements, let us begin reading from chapter 2, wherein the political will be defined. So we want to bring up either the chapter or the screenshot 26, either way. I will start reading. Quote, "A definition of the political can be obtained only by discovering and defining the specifically political categories. In contrast to the various relatively independent endeavors of human thought and action, particularly the moral, aesthetic, and economic, the political has its own criteria which express themselves in a characteristic way." Pausing briefly. Again, note the distinction from moral, aesthetic, and economic things with the political. The political is not those things. Continuing. The political must therefore rest on its own ultimate distinctions, to which all action with a specifically political meaning can be traced. Let us assume that in the realm of morality, the final distinctions are between good and evil. In aesthetics, beautiful and ugly. In economics, profitable and unprofitable. The question then is whether there is also a special distinction which can serve as a simple criterion of the political and of what it consists. The nature of such a political distinction is surely different from that of those others. It is independent of them, and as such can speak clearly for itself. The specific political distinction to which political actions and motives can be reduced is that between friend and enemy. Pausing for a second. Now, Schmidt is using the term in German. I think it's pronounced fiend in the enemy and not find, and not the enemy in the enemy and not the foe sense. Mr. Quinn, would you like to? I'd asked you about this in particular.
Yeah, Schmidt will talk about this later in the essay, but the German distinction that the footnote refers to itself derives from a Latin distinction. The Romans had two words for people they went to war with. There were inimicus, which literally means non-friend, and hostes, which means enemy. So when the Romans would fight the Greeks were inimicus, and so one rule of civilized warfare would apply to them, whereas when the Romans fought the Germans were hostes, people with whom coexistence was existentially impossible, and so the war was much more brutal and involved far more atrocities. So this distinction in Latin between inimicus and hostes finds its way into the German, and now in English, you might best characterize it as enemy and opponent. They're distinct concepts. Enemy is not just everyone you dislike. It has a specific meaning with a root in the German and the Latin.
Correct. The enemy is a collective with which one other collective, at least, cannot coexist. They are a threat to that collective's very existence and way of life. Continuing, quote, this provides a definition in the sense of a criterion and not as an exhaustive definition or one indicative of substantial content. Insofar as it is not derived from other criteria, the antithesis of friend and enemy corresponds to the relatively independent criteria of other antitheses, good and evil in the moral sphere, beautiful and ugly in the aesthetic sphere, and so on. In any event, it is independent, not in the sense of a distinct new domain, but in that it can neither be based on any one antithesis or any combination of other antitheses, nor can it be traced to these. If the antithesis of good and evil is not simply identical with that of the beautiful and ugly, profitable and unprofitable, and cannot be directly reduced to the others, then the antithesis of friend and enemy must even less be confused with or mistaken for the others. The distinction of friend and enemy denotes the utmost degree of intensity of a union or separation, of an association or disassociation. It can exist theoretically and practically without having simultaneously to draw upon all these moral, aesthetic, economic, or other distinctions. The political enemy need not be morally evil or aesthetically ugly. He need not appear as an economic competitor, and it may even be advantageous to engage with him in business transactions. But he is, nevertheless, the other, the stranger, and it is sufficient for his nature that he, in a specially intense way, existentially something different and alien, so that in the extreme case, conflicts with him are possible. These can neither be decided by a previously determined general norm nor by the judgment of a disinterested and therefore neutral third party. And I'll just finish reading chapter 2 here.
Well, wait. Before you do that,
there's a lot there. Let's talk about that.
So,
Ryan, you go first.
Before we lose the thread, what Schmidt is trying to do here once again, because he is working with a perhaps less developed political theory scene, is he is trying to differentiate the political aspect of human society and values and beliefs and whatnot else. What he is not saying here is that the political needs to be excluded from these other things in all times and places. What he is not saying here is that these other concerns do not factor into these considerations, to the reality of friend and enemy. What he is saying, though, is that the political is different and distinct from these things. So if I am just holding an object in my hand, I notice that it has a specific shape and color. The object has these two things, but we nevertheless recognize that the shape, like this category of a shape, is not the same thing as a category of the color. Colors are different from shapes, so in the same way, the economic, the moral, and the political are distinct, separate things that nevertheless may appear in concert in reality. So this is something to keep in mind. He is not making an argument that all things must be reduced only and always to a political element, nor that any political actions are amoral in the extreme. What he's trying to do is he's trying to make a distinction between these categories. That was just that's something that I've seen from some more extreme types that try to boil down absolutely everything to pure political consideration without considering these other things, as if they disappear just because we recognize that friends and enemies exist.
Yeah, the friend-enemy distinction, the political is just one dimension of human action. It's not the totality. Your enemies need not be evil. They need not be good. That's irrelevant to the question of whether they are friend or enemy. The only question when they're friend or enemy are, as Schmidt here says, whether conflicts with him are possible. That doesn't mean you have to go to war with your political enemy. It doesn't mean you have to be in conflict. But wherever the potential for conflict between groups exists, that is where the political exists.
And, as that final sentence says, this is not determined by a neutral third party. No third party can judge two other sides to be friend and enemy. It is a case between friend and enemy, mutually determined in which
I don't even know if it's
politics
mutually determined.
exists.
It could be unilaterally determined. You
Well,
don't
it becomes
necessarily.
mutual once it's unilateral. It can't
Yeah.
really be.
Oh, you're in that
It can
sense,
never
yeah.
be right, because if I unilaterally determine you to be enemy, naturally you, for your very existence, would have to recognize me as such, regardless of my reasoning, right? So yes, it could be done unilaterally, but effectively that would immediately uh, effectuate a mutual response from you. Um, but yes, theoretically, it could be unilateral. I will finish chapter 2, which more or less summarizes a lot of what was just said. Quote, only the actual participants can correctly recognize, understand, and judge the concrete situation and settle the extreme case of conflict. Each participant is in a position to judge whether the adversary intends to negate his opponent's way of life, and therefore must be repulsed or fought in order to preserve one's own form of existence. Emotionally, the enemy is treated as being evil and ugly, because every distinction, most of all the political, as the strongest and most intense of the distinctions and categorizations, draws upon other distinctions for support. This does not alter the autonomy of such distinctions. Consequently, the reverse is also true. The morally evil, aesthetically ugly, or economically damaging need not be necessarily the enemy. The morally good, aesthetically beautiful, and economically profitable need not necessarily become the friend in the specifically political sense of the word. Thereby, the inherently objective nature and autonomy of the political becomes evident by virtue of its being able to treat, distinguish, and comprehend the friend enemy antithesis independently of other antitheses. Continuing in chapter 3.
Well, here, now that we're getting into chapter 3, it might be worth once again emphasizing this is between groups.
Yes.
This will become very important later. There's a whole section to this, but it's something to keep in mind that the political is determined between groups. So, in our explanation earlier, like you declare me an enemy, I must respond and treat you as an enemy. This is not necessarily on the individual level. In fact, in Schmidt's theory, this is a group level. This is not a. It would be very difficult for one individual, if not entirely theoretically impossible, to become the group that becomes an enemy or friend or whatnot else. That person belongs to groups that constitute this political sphere that we're talking about.
Yes, the political, at essence, is the management of collective violence and the potential for collective violence. It doesn't have an individual application.
Absolutely. Let's pause and ponder a bit on that idea we had discussed of whether or not this can be determined unilaterally. So, I think everyone would agree that the state of North Korea regards the United States of America as an enemy, that's being it is a threat to its state of existence. Now, does that in turn require that the United States also recognize North Korea as an enemy?
Yes, it does. I mean, the only variable is the level of seriousness to which we append that recognition. The recognition is there, and we got a lot more serious about it when they started launching ballistic missiles and detonating nukes, because suddenly they were able to put their enmity into practice against us, at least potentially. So yes, I mean, a group can be another group's enemy and not be taken seriously because it is incapable of existential harm, but the fact it intends existential harm itself is the distinction that creates the political dynamic.
Well, and we can perhaps bring that into more recent events as well. Just at least looking at actions and not rhetoric. The American right, which itself is a political group, among other other kinds of groups as well, um, by action until very recently did not consider the group of on the militant left, the anti-fascist group. Uh, it did not consider it to be an important enemy, but it very recently found out that the inability to coexist with that group without the inevitable consequence of outright violence has led to the American conservative group, at least in action now, to perhaps rank the anti-fascists as a higher threat of enemy. This might be interesting, at least for the audience, because we have the state involved. There is conflict, especially over control of the state. But these groups are not necessarily on the country level, so you can abstract this down to different groups, so long as they are groups and territories that cannot coexist, at least cannot default, or cannot not default to war.
Indeed, this the political does not take place only at the state level. It can also take place intrastate, as Schmidt will go on to discuss.
Excellent. Well, let's get into chapter 3 now, where we will discuss exactly this. Quote, the friend and enemy concepts are to be understood in their concrete and existential sense, not as metaphors or symbols, not mixed and weakened by economic, moral, or other conceptions, least of all in a private individualistic sense as a psychological expression of private emotions and tendencies. They are neither.
So let's just pause there. So private emotions and tendencies. So your personal antipathy to other individuals has nothing to do with the political. The friend-enemy distinction is not, as Ryan has already said, between you and people you dislike. It is between two groups who pose existential threats to each other's ways of life.
And this is extremely important, because this is where the meme of Carl Schmitt goes entirely wrong. You have people online who are barely organized, if at all, meaning that they are in a group, but they have not made themselves party to that group's existence, perhaps. And they go online and they say this person, this group, or whatever is the enemy, as if their fiat, their proclamation makes someone an enemy. Similarly, they'll declare people friends. It's like the memed idea of Carl Schmitt that people have is that I can declare and make people enemies or friends, when in actuality, for you the individual, that's determined before you, basically, or outside of your control. If I, the individual, am in a group, the fact that I am in a group and that group cannot coexist with other specific groups means that there is an enemy, and I can recognize that or ignore it or whatever else on the individual level, but it is there. I can't declare that into existence. I can't declare friends or enemies into existence, nor can I declare them out of existence. This is perhaps the most important misapplication of Schmitt. Right now, he's just talking about personal emotions. I really like or dislike these groups, but it's the exact same thing that we see most often now. I really do not like this group, so I'm going to label them an enemy. I'm being a good Schmittian or whatever else. And it's entirely wrong. It's entirely backwards. Even it's applying Schmitt on like an individual level, oftentimes emotional, and on like a sort of executive fiat level, which is entirely meaningless to this. So far, we haven't even brought in anything like that. It just is. These are groups. They're in conflict. You can't change that without changing the nature of the groups, perhaps.
Correct. The political is only at a group level. There are no private political friends and enemies, and it is not declarative. It describes a concrete, real, existing threat, existential threat to some other group between your group. If that does not exist, then there is no politics between them, because there is no friend and enemy distinction between them. Continuing where I left off, quote, they are neither normative nor pure spiritual antitheses. Liberalism, in one of its typical dilemmas, to be treated further under Section 8, of intellect and economics, has attempted to transform the enemy from the viewpoint of economics into a competitor, and from the intellectual point into a debating adversary. In the domain of economics, there are no enemies, only competitors, and in a thoroughly moral and ethical world, perhaps only debating adversaries. It is irrelevant here whether one rejects, accepts, or perhaps finds it an atavistic remnant of our barbaric times that nations continue to group themselves according to friend and enemy, or hopes that the antithesis will one day vanish from the world, or whether it is perhaps sound pedagogic reasoning to imagine that enemies no longer exist at all. The concern here is neither with abstractions nor with normative ideals, but with inherent reality and the real possibility of such a distinction. One may or may not share these hopes and pedagogic ideals, but rationally speaking, it cannot be denied that nations continue to group themselves according to friend and enemy antithesis, and that the distinction still remains actual today, and that this is an ever present possibility for every people existing in the political sphere. The enemy is not merely any competitor or just any partner of a conflict in general. He is also
Okay,
not the private
let's
adversary.
pause there. Here,
Okay.
before we move on talking about the private adversary, there's something that's very important here. And this is, I will admit here, I might be extending Schmidt's theory beyond what he actually wrote, but I think it's entirely actionable. Schmidt writing here is talking about the nation, the actual the race of people, the group, Germans, Poles, and whatnot else that usually have their own states and societies and whatnot else. But you can see this in America. We spent the first however many episodes of this series on American spirits talking about the real existence of an American nation, an American people that has an ethnic, linguistic, cultural heritage and a specific geography that would fit most definitions. And you can see that if you are an American and you fit into that group by birth, quite frankly, you have yourself friends and enemies that are determined for you because of your belonging to that group. So this is something that is very important to understand. Schmidt here talks about nations. We still have the nations today. It's very important for us politically. So keep that in mind. But as we were talking about earlier, I think you can also apply this to other groups that are not necessarily on the national level, but I'm sure we can elaborate on that more as we go on.
As we found out 2 weeks ago, in this imperfectly moral and just world, there are other things than debating partners.
Yes, we will get to that shortly as I finish this page. Quote, the enemy is not merely any competitor or just any partner of a conflict in general. He is also not the private adversary whom one hates. An enemy exists only when, at least potentially, one fighting collectivity of people confronts a similar collectivity. The enemy is solely the public enemy, because everything that has a relationship to such a collectivity of men, particularly to a whole nation, becomes public by virtue of such a relationship. The enemy is hostis, not inimicus, in the broader sense. Now, pausing there, let's ask some questions here about this state of affairs. Public enemies, private enemies do not exist. They're public because they inherently have a public relation due to being defined by a collectivity. Now, you mentioned a group earlier, the American right, for example. Is the American right a fighting collectivity of people that could at least potentially confront a similar collectivity of people? I asked that to the two of you.
Fighting collectivity, it certainly has the potential to be. It is not particularly actualized at this time, but for the purposes of the analysis, I think yes.
We could also take the term heritage Americans, or heritage Americans, at least potentially fighting collectivity that could confront a similar type of collectivity.
Oh, certainly.
Yeah, right.
Indeed. Now, who threaten that collectivity? Let's see. Do Protestants threaten the very existence of the American right? Yes or no? Or heritage Americans? No.
Yeah, also no. But let's keep with one or the other.
do Roman Catholics threaten the very existence of the American right or heritage Americans?
Once again, no.
No.
We'll clarify. If I say pagans, I think you'll understand the particular types of pagans I'm referring to, the ones who sort of are established within the American right, not the sort of witches who are associated with the left or other groups like that. I'm talking about a particular, let's say, Odinistic type of pagan. Are those people a threat to the very existence of heritage Americans or the American right?
Also, no.
No.
Okay, exactly. So the point being made here is that you may privately not like these people, not want them in your group, etc., and that's perfectly fine because they're all sort of moral, even economic, uh, or whatever distinctions you can make that would exclude them, and that's perfectly fine. But this has absolutely nothing to do with politics. It has nothing to do with the friend enemy distinction, which is what politics is. It is not defined by who you privately liked. It is defined by an actually existing, at least potentially, state of affairs where one group's very existence is threatened by another group. Now, there is very clearly a group whose very existence threatens the heritage Americans, or we could also say the American right. It's difficult to define very, very precisely these groups that consist of literally hundreds of millions of people. But we do have words for them. Recently, I like the term Jacobin, however you want to pronounce it, or previously you might call them liberals or just the left. I think there's a very clear recognition, especially in the last 2 weeks, that one that these two groups are enemies because they mutually threaten the very existence of the other group. Would you agree with that, either of you?
Yeah, I mean, Schmidt is careful to say a threat to the existence of the way of life of the group, and the way of life of the American right is fundamentally incompatible with the way of life of the American left, and to that extent, they are mutually enemies. This is not to say that open warfare is necessary, but it is to say that it is possible, and therefore we are in the realm of the political.
And the same thing with Heritage Americans as well, which is a very similar but not entirely identical group to the American right. The American left, as a collective or a group, has made it very clear that the existence of the Heritage American group in any way, even approximating how it once existed, is a intolerable injustice, and therefore they have set out to kill them, destroy them, seize property, distribute property, and destroy their homeland and whatever else. So this is something else to keep in mind: is that the both groups have found the American left to be an irreconcilable enemy in the form that it's taken on.
There are a couple of other group distinctions I can make, but I'll bring them up later. Let's just continue reading for now. Quote, as German and other languages do not distinguish between the private and political enemy, many misconceptions and falsifications are possible. The often quoted love your enemies, Matthew 5:44, Luke 6:27, reads, uh, let's see, diligit inimicos vestros, and not diligit hostes vestros. No mention is made of the political enemy.
Yeah, this
Never
is
in the thousand. Yeah, go ahead.
sorry, yeah, not to ground this stream too particularly in time, but just today on Twitter, there's been a lot of back and forth about Christian forgiveness and loving your enemies, and here we see in the Latin much more precisely enunciated what is meant by that commandment, which is love your unfriends, the people who are not existential threats to you, not love your hostes, your hostiles, your enemies who want your destruction or the destruction of your way of life. So it's not as universalist a statement in the Latin as it is in English.
Well, and the
Yeah,
other interesting thing here is that this would be even then, if you abstract this to the political level, you love your enemies, in English at least being the correct grammatical form for the sentence here. Um, this is just entirely irrelevant to a doctrine on groups. The last that I checked, most Christian denominations do not have a doctrine of group forgiveness or group wrongings or whatnot else, though groups do very much factor into biblical doctrines and whatnot else. But this is not. I'm unaware of a right of group confession such that we can absolve, say, a group of marauding pirates or whatever else. Particularly if they're still in the act of doing it.
Now, this is really important. I cannot read the Greek, obviously, because I can't pronounce Greek characters, but Schmidt also provides the Greek and the Latin. And as we discussed earlier, we have Inimicus and we have Hostis. And the actual text reads, uses the word Inimicos and not Hosties when it's talking about who to love. Mr. Quinn, would you like to once again tell us what is the difference between those two words? Because this is really important.
Yeah, so Inimicus in the Roman conception was someone with whom you might have a conflict, but with whom coexistence was possible. They were, civilized versus barbarians. They were people who, by their very existence, were not necessarily inimical to your own existence. Whereas hostes, by their very existence, represented an existential threat to your existence, and so were to be treated very differently.
Yes, and just a side point here, this is why it is very important to be able to interpret scripture in, if not the original, at least very close to the original form, because the translation to English actually loses some meaning. This is really important. So, anyway, continuing, quote, no mention is made of the political enemy. Never in the 1,000-year struggle between Christians and Muslims did it occur to a Christian to surrender rather than defend Europe out of love toward the Saracens or Turks. The enemy in the political sense need not be hated personally, and in the private sphere only does it make sense to love one's enemy, i.e. one's adversary. The Bible quotation touches on the political antithesis even less than it intends to dissolve, for example, the antithesis of good and evil or beautiful and ugly. It certainly does not mean that one should love and support the enemies of one's own people. The political is the most intense and extreme antagonism, and every concrete antagonism becomes that much more political the closer it gets to the most extreme point, that of the friend-enemy grouping.
Here, before we continue, just some final remarks on that here, since we're actually discussing the differences between private and public enemies, and the extremity of a group being an enemy. Just because, as I mentioned at the outset, this is becoming very important to Americans, just because it's being talked about. You do actually have, especially clergymen now, trying to refute this. Quite nonsensically. So you will have still clergymen that in the face of this will still exhort you to, basically on the group level, on the people that you cannot coexist with, to treat them basically as a treat that group as a private person with which you just have some sort of an adversarial relationship with. And they will guise this in terms of martyrdom. For instance, there was an LCMS pastor recently who said that he's like, oh yeah, they do want you dead. Haven't you ever heard of martyrdom? I don't think that we've heard of, say, nations, ethnicities, or whatever else being martyred. Usually it is specific people or nameless people that are only known because that specific person was in an event. Say, we have named martyrs in sanctoral calendars, or we have nameless martyrs who were, say, like the Holy Innocents or something. Those are specific people. We don't have, groups like this nation was martyred because whenever a conquering horde approached the castle walls, they decided to let the conquering horde in and just destroy them. This is entirely foreign. So this is something that will become a point of contention, especially as this gets talked about more, as it enters into right-wing thought more explicitly. And it's something to keep in mind. You especially, since most of our audience are Americans, most Americans are Christian, or at least have a Christian upbringing, you need to be cognizant of what in history, scripture, church doctrine, whatever else, is meant to be exercised on the individual or the personal level between persons. And you need to understand that that may not necessarily apply to the group level. It is not sinful for the vast majority of Christian history, and certainly not in any scriptural doctrine, for a nation to defend itself, for a group to exist, or whatnot else. So this is something to keep in mind as this receives pushback.
Yes, and while we're here, before we move too far from identifying collectives that are within the friend and enemy grouping, let's name a few more. Let's look at perhaps the, let's say, economic point of view. Are libertarians a threat to heritage Americans in their way of life or their very existence? And let's say not the political party, but the Austrian school of economics, let's say, are people who are of that persuasion in their economic thinking a threat to heritage Americans?
Usually quite the opposite, is what I would say.
Indeed. Now,
well, leaving that aside, even if you wanted to take the opposite position that Austrian economics was poisonous and wrong, still the answer would be no.
now we could ask ourselves about the Libertarian Party. I would say it's a very, let's say,
well, the Libertarian
minor...
Party, of course, is a political party, so they've inserted
Yes.
themselves into that realm voluntarily. But having done so, they are sufficiently impotent to not rank very highly on the list of threats.
No, but
Yeah,
I would say
right.
the Libertarian Party is quite clearly on the enemy side of the friend-enemy distinction.
Yes.
Now, for the heritage Americans, certainly, yes.
Now let's say, yes, for heritage Americans is what we're talking about here. Let's say are fascists, to the extent that they even exist, a threat to heritage Americans? Do they fall on the enemy side? Now, what about, and using these words, we're using these words only in the modern sense, people who describe themselves as anti-fascists, are those people a threat to the existence of heritage Americans as two collectives?
Yes.
Yeah, we've learned the answer in the last 2 weeks, very extremely. If we didn't learn the lesson like a decade ago at this point.
Yeah, in 2001, we could have had a debate on this, but even then, no, because going back to the years of lead, this was an issue. But yes, we can say at this moment in time confidently the answer is yes.
Let's just review a few of those. The Libertarian Party, why are they a threat to the very existence of heritage Americans? It's not simply because they have wrong ideas, but because that party facilitates left-wing policies that would literally erode the defenses the heritage Americans have against foreign enemies. That's effectively the entire purpose of that party. That's why it falls.
I think that's a charitable view. It's not merely the indirect threat of eroding our defenses to other groups, but they promote policies which themselves tend to create violence against heritage Americans.
Well, and I was going to say they explicitly align themselves in action and not just rhetoric with anti-fascism. The party does. So, like we've already acknowledged that the anti-fascist group it refuses to coexist with the heritage American group. The Libertarian Party falls under the anti-fascist group. It doesn't have to really be much more complex than that.
Exactly. But it's important to really understand these things. And I don't mean to just keep belaboring this point, but this is sort of the central problem that needs to be addressed in the way people understand what politics actually is, which is the friend-enemy distinction, and how the distinction is actually made. So I'm sure the listeners can start applying the logic to the other groups we've mentioned or future groups. Anyway, let's continue on here. In its entirety, the state as an organized political entity decides for itself the friend-enemy distinction. Furthermore, next to the primary political decisions and under the protection of the decision taken, Numerous secondary concepts of the political emanate. As to the equation of politics and state, discussed under Section 1, it has the effect, for example, of contrasting a political attitude of a state with party politics so that one can speak of the state's domestic, religious, educational, communal, social policy, and so on. Notwithstanding, the state encompasses and relativizes all these antitheses. However, an antithesis and antagonism remain here within the state's domain, which have relevance for the concept of the political. Finally, even more banal forms of politics appear, forms which assume parasite and caricature like configurations. What remains here from the original friend enemy grouping is only some sort of antagonistic moment, which manifests itself in all sorts of tactics and practices, competitions and intrigues, and the most peculiar dealings and manipulations are called politics. But the fact that the substance of the political is contained in the context of a concrete antagonism is still expressed in everyday language, even when awareness of the extreme case has been entirely lost. Would anyone like to elaborate on what he's saying there? Because that's actually a pretty important sort of a fractal comprehension of politics.
Yeah, when you're talking about politics, you're talking about groups. Groups can mean things other than a nation state. So as you go down through society, parts of society will themselves break off into different groups who may or may not have existential conflicts between them. And where they do, you're dealing with the political.
And if you read the whole essay, Schmidt has a very sophisticated idea or conception of society. I think he oftentimes gets caricatured as like this, almost like a stereotypical, like absolutist, where society to Schmidt is just the state or something, which is just entirely not true. If you read the essay, he will talk about like one person can belong to many different groups. These groups can oppose state policy even at the height of the absolute state. I believe he talks about churches and trade unions opposing Bismarck, which Schmidt at least seems to believe at this point when he was writing was the height of German state power. And they managed to at least oppose the policy to such a point that it was a failure. He has a very sophisticated concept of society that I think goes beyond what he's been memed as. So it's important to keep in mind these groups that exist on smaller scales.
Now, let us continue. Quote, this becomes evident in daily speech and can be exemplified by two obvious phenomena. First, all political concepts, images, and terms have a polemical meaning. They are focused on a specific conflict and are bound to a concrete situation. The result, which manifests itself in war or revolution, is a friend-enemy grouping, and they turn into empty and ghost-like abstractions when the situation disappears. Words such as state, republic, society, class, as well as sovereignty, constitutional state, absolutism, dictatorship, economic planning, neutral or total state, and so on, are incomprehensible if one does not know exactly who is to be affected, combated, refuted, or negated by such a term.
So this is just to pause very quickly. This is important and something that we here on the stream have recognized in the past. So when we talk about especially American history, you'll see that very rarely do we like try to pick sides in a historical fight, and if we ever comment on it, it's because it's either still ongoing or a side now resembles a past side so much that it's that you can see very clear parallels. But even then, very rarely do we like describe ourselves as some historical side. And Schmidt here is explaining why that might have occurred to us when we set the stream up. And it's just because that political fight between those groups is no longer relevant usually. We no longer have like existential fights between like Tories and patriots or whatnot else. We do have existential fights between conservatives, radicals, the left, and whatnot else, which we can draw parallels to, like we did in the previous two streams. But I forget if we mentioned it on stream or in private. This is why it makes no sense for, say, someone right now to call themselves a Tory in the American context, even though many people online did like 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah, and another a beautiful way to illustrate this would be to return to your earlier question, Charlie. Excuse me. You asked if Protestants and then Catholics were a threat, were an enemy of Heritage America, and in both cases we answered no. The interesting question now is to ask, are Protestants and Catholics enemies of each other? There was undoubtedly a time in history when the answer to that would have been unequivocally yes. But in today's context, that's very much less the case, if it's the case at all, that Protestant and Catholics are enemies in the political sense that they are existential threats to each other.
Perhaps only in the weakest possible form, which is to say that the distinction practically doesn't exist.
Certainly in America.
It probably exists more so between Heritage Americans and the Libertarian Party, which is practically a non-entity. So, but one might even rank them as friends simply because they're both mutually threatened by other enemies at this point. So we could even say that at this particular moment, the Roman Catholic Church and all Protestant churches, well, not all, but it's obviously it's a very broad term under Protestant, right? But in general, Protestant churches and Roman Catholic churches are actually friends at this moment because the factor of Christianity itself is so existentially threatened by mutual enemies that naturally the relationship becomes friend in this particular case.
Exactly.
Well,
that's pretty interesting.
I was just going to say very quickly, we can break this down to an even more practical level. Are American Catholics right now able to, as a group, fight against the group American Protestants, and are they themselves, the Protestants, able to fight against the group American Catholics? It would seem to me to be no, specifically as understood in those two groups. There might be Protestants and Catholics individually in other groups that are able to fight, and other groups that we talked about earlier, but the idea of those two groups in particular warring between each other seems to be entirely infeasible right now.
Right. And I did not bring this hypothetical up to bait sectarian conflict. I'm bringing it up to make the point that Schmidt reiterates again and again. The political deals with concrete existential conflicts, as in what happened 500 years ago is irrelevant to the political now. Only concrete, real, existing existential threats delineate enemies and friends.
Yes, and this is really why I also brought up libertarianism in the Austrian school in particular. That's an interesting case. The Austrian school, which effectively are people who tend to associate around the Mises Institute, right? Hans Hermann Hoppe, we think of Tom Woods, former president Jeff Deist. I'm sure you could, obviously Ryan yourself, we could think of many other people associated with that institute who are of that school. Now, one might not like libertarian or Austrian economics, but the concrete reality is that the majority of those people representing that group are not currently enemies in any way of Heritage Americans. There's no interpretation one can give. Whatever you think of their ideology, this is on a completely different realm than the friend-enemy distinction. The fact of the matter is, the Austrian school is quite clearly aligned, aligned as a friend of Heritage Americans and not on the enemy side. There's simply no way I can see to parse that school into the enemy category like we did with the Libertarian Party, right? So I think this is interesting because ostensibly these things sort of have the same ideology, but this example helps us abstract ideology and private disagreements out of it because you can identify concrete groups based on concrete behaviors of their individual members. Anyway, I don't know if you agree or find that useful or disagree there, but
wholly agree.
Yeah, I agree as well.
Great. Let's continue. Quote, above all, the polemical character determines the use of the word political, regardless of whether the adversary is designated as non-political in the sense of harmless, or vice versa if one wants to disqualify or denounce him as political in order to portray oneself as non-political in the sense of purely scientific, purely moral, purely juristic, purely aesthetic, purely economic, or on the basis of similar purities and thereby superior. Secondly, In usual domestic polemics, the word political is today often used interchangeably with party politics. The inevitable lack of objectivity in political decisions, which is only the reflex to suppress the politically inherent friend-enemy antithesis, manifests itself in the regrettable forms and aspects of the scramble for office and the politics of patronage. The demand for depoliticization, which arises in this context, means only the rejection of party politics, etc. The equation politics equals party politics is possible whenever antagonisms among domestic political parties succeed in weakening the all embracing political unit, the state. Let's pause there for a second and consider that. The equation politics equals party politics is possible whenever antagonisms among domestic political parties succeed in weakening the all embracing political unit, the state. So at this point in the United States of America, is politics equal party politics? I think no.
Yeah, that's tough because I
Yeah,
actually
I would actually be inclined to take the other side of that. I would think we are sufficiently weakened by internal divisions that we've compromised our distinctions via other states. And so our politics really are party politics. When you have one party bringing in millions of people from outside the political unit, the state, to get one up on their rivals within the state, I think you're well into the realm of party politics there.
Well, the reason I say no is because there's it could really be yes or no. I say no, I guess looking at it in a what are the parties right now? We mentioned the Libertarian Party, but that's kind of irrelevant. We have the Democrat Party and the Republican Party. The Republican Party, and this might be changing now, but it seems like the Republican Party as an entity is still more or less in political alignment with the Democratic Party, whereas these two party apparatuses do not really regard each other as enemies. They are friends. And an insurgent MAGA faction in the Republican Party, if you want to take it, see, it sort of depends if you want to parse MAGA out as its sort of own political party or if we're strictly working on the definitions of political parties. I'm not sure. Why don't either of you
Yeah,
make the opposite
I'm not
case?
sufficiently comfortable with how Schmidt is using the term party politics, but if you want to take party politics in the small p uh, meaning of party, party just a constituency within society, then I think we're absolutely in party politics. And the fact that the two putative capital P parties do not choose not to represent one of those constituencies and rather band together, I think is a particular idiosyncrasy of the American system, not the fact that we haven't devolved into party politics.
I mean
I think that's
just
sound.
something else as well is that party politics doesn't necessarily have to refer to like a legally established organization. I mean
Yeah,
there are
that's what I
political
was trying to
parties
get
that
at with small
right.
p and capital P.
Yeah,
But
right. And this is and that's kind of why I lean in the direction I did is because I think I can partial out say like MAGA republicanism from the rest of the GOP and the Democratic Party because that is where you're seeing groups unable to coexist and they are on like the actual party political level. It's just that one group is unable to coexist with another group and they share a formal political party.
and I
And
would go
it's
further to state that that mismatch that Charlie points to is itself symptomatic of a descent into party politics. 50 years ago, the internal divisions within the United States were weak enough that the two institutions were aligned as against outside forces. But as those internal divisions have sharpened, the the real parties, the small p parties, have now devolved into politics with each other, whereas the institutions, they simply haven't caught up to that reality yet.
Yes, I agree. You've convinced me when we think about it in terms of the small p party politics Schmidt would have been contemporary with anyway in these parliamentary systems, even regardless whether or not it's actual formally registered political parties or whatever. That the state does not have the absolute uh, decision making power over friend and enemy at the moment because the state on one hand, could very easily have been the enemy of heritage Americans uh, right now. But the state, as such, right now, under Trump Vance instead of Biden Harris, is not necessarily the enemy of heritage Americans. I mean, how could it be, right? Because the head of the state is Donald Trump, who's quite clearly not the enemy of heritage Americans. So we are at a point actually where the equation politics equals party politics is possible, because the state has been weakened. Anyway, that was a question I had while reading this, so I'm glad we hashed that out. Continuing, quote, the intensification of internal antagonisms has the effect of weakening the common identity vis-a-vis another state. If domestic conflicts among political parties have become the sole political difference, the most extreme degree of internal political tension is thereby reached, i.e., the domestic, not the foreign friend and enemy groupings, are decisive for armed conflict. The ever present possibility of conflict must always be kept in mind. If one wants to speak of politics in the context of the primacy of internal politics, then this conflict no longer refers to war between organized nations, but to civil war. End quote. I think
Yeah,
that's very incisive itself.
yeah, that speaks terrifyingly for itself.
Absolutely. I mean, the decisive friend enemy distinction that currently exists in the United States is absolutely internal groupings. There's absolutely no decisive external enemy that the United States has as a coherent entity, or at least heritage Americans have, um, that is external. The primary enemy of heritage Americans is actually internal to its own society, within its own state, which does not bode well based on what Mr. Schmidt writes here. I will continue. We're not reading the whole book, even though it seems like it. We're getting close to the end of chapter 3, and then we'll jump forward to a few other topics. Um, let's see, where was I? Yes, okay. There we go. Quote, for to the enemy concept belongs the ever-present possibility of combat. All peripherals must be left aside from this term, including military details and the development of weapons technology. War is armed combat between organized political entities. Civil war is armed combat within an organized unit. A self-laceration endangers the survival of the latter. The essence of a weapon is that it is a means of physically killing human beings. Just as the term enemy in the word combat too is to be understood in its original existential sense. All right, let's stop there again and consider that.
Yeah, it's again this theme. Schmidt is only dealing in terms of the concrete. This is a very empirical, objective, analytical look at human nature in this particular slice of human nature that is armed conflict between groups. And it's important. I know I've been banging this drum forever, but as Marian says, this the friend enemy's distinction becomes memeified and much is lost when we're talking about it in the Schmittian sense. We are dealing in concrete realities.
Indeed, and let's look at it within an organized unit. So within the organized unit of American society, a self-laceration endangers the survival of the latter. There's clearly ways in which what we call the left or Jacobins are self-lacerating American society that endangers the very existence of heritage Americans.
Schmidt is not describing vibes. He's not describing essays. This is human beings killing human beings we're talking about.
The essence of a weapon is that it is a means of physically killing human beings. So when we talk about weapons, we're talking about any category that accomplishes that means, not simply military details and things like that. Could a weapon be a government policy?
Yes.
Yes, clearly. Let's see. Okay,
I
continue.
mean, that's the story of a good chunk of the last century is government policy just starving people or relocating them and killing them along the way if they were in the wrong group. So that's or rather the enemy group, not the wrong group. So that's
And
the
Schmidt wrote
important to
this
understand.
before a lot of that is the thing.
Yes, he did actually. Continuing. Quote, it does not mean competition, nor does it mean pure intellectual controversy, nor symbolic wrestlings in which, after all, every human being is somehow always involved, for it is a fact that the entire life of a human being is a struggle and every human being symbolically a combatant. The friend, enemy, and combat concepts receive their real meaning precisely because they refer to the real possibility of physical killing. War follows from enmity. War is the existential negation of the enemy. It is the most extreme consequence of enmity. It does not have to be common, normal, something ideal, or desirable, but it must nevertheless remain a real possibility for as long as the concept of the enemy remains valid. Oh, do we want to stop there? I mean,
Yeah, just a German English thing here. Enmity, the English word, is perhaps susceptible of misconstruing here. Feindheit, eneminess. So the statement is made in the context of the political distinction that Schmidt has been laying out for this entire essay.
yes, war is the existential negation of the enemy. It is quite clear that there is an enemy grouping that is seeking and currently prosecuting, in some cases through physical killing, the existential negation of heritage Americans. That's abundantly clear. Continuing, quote, it is by no means as though the political signifies nothing but devastating war and every political deed a military action, but by no means as though every nation would be uninterruptedly faced with the friend enemy alternative vis a vis every other nation. And after all, could not the politically reasonable course reside in avoiding war? The definition of the political suggested here neither favors war nor militarism, neither imperialism nor pacifism, nor is it an attempt to idealize the victorious war or the successful revolution as a social ideal, since neither war nor revolution is something social or something ideal. The military battle itself is not the continuation of politics by other means, as the famous term of Clausewitz is generally incorrectly cited. I just want to pause there. That's really important. War is not the continuation of politics by other means. You can debate that in your own time. That is 100% wrong. Please do not ever think that. And Schmidt
Nor did
demonstrates that
Clausewitz
quite
say
clearly.
that, but yeah.
Yes, he did. He did not say that either. It's both misquoted and wrong. Um, continuing, war has its own strategic, tactical, and other rules and points of view, but they all presuppose that the political decision has already been made as to who the enemy is. In war, the adversaries most often confront each other openly. Normally, they are identifiable by a uniform, and the distinction of friend and enemy is therefore no longer a political problem, which the fighting soldier has to solve. A British diplomat correctly stated in this context that the politician is better schooled for battle than the soldier because the politician fights his whole life, whereas the soldier does so in exceptional circumstances only. War is neither the aim, nor the purpose, nor even the very content of politics, but as an ever present possibility, it is the leading presupposition which determines in a characteristic way human action and thinking, and thereby creates a specifically political behavior.
Again,
So
the management of the potential for collective violence is politics.
And
perfectly
it's sort of
summarized.
important to point out here in this excerpt that we just read is that Carl Schmitt is not prescribing a moderate solution where you go to war like some of the time in the Golden Mean when he's talking about the political favors neither pacifism or militarism or imperialism or whatever else. What he's talking about there is just that a war is the like the final, perhaps the final choice in a non-war political scene. It's something that can result. He's not prescribing like a middle of the road policy where you just for no reason whatsoever have to do some war half the time and or whatnot else. He's specifically talking about war is an outcome of political intermixing specifically, and that is what makes it political in the first place, is that it can happen. So something to
And
keep in mind.
yeah, and Charlie, just to put a bow on the Clausewitz point, do you want to read footnote 14?
Certainly. Karl von Clausewitz says, quote, war is nothing but a continuation of political intercourse with a mixture of other means. End quote. War is for him a mere instrument of politics. This cannot be denied, but its meaning for the understanding of the essence of politics is thereby still not exhausted. To be precise, war, for Clausewitz, is not merely one of many instruments, but the ultima ratio of the friend and enemy grouping. War has its own grammar, i.e., special military technical laws, but politics remains its brain. It does not have its own logic. This can only be derived from the friend and enemy concept. And the sentence on page 121 reveals this core of politics. Quote, if war belongs to politics, it will thereby assume its character. The more grandiose and powerful it becomes, so will also the war, and this may be carried to the point at which war reaches its absolute form. End quote. Now, continuing on, trying to get to the end of chapter 3 here. Quote, the criterion of the friend and enemy distinction in no way implies that one particular nation must forever be the friend or enemy of another specific nation, or that a state of neutrality is not possible, or could not be politically reasonable. As with every political concept, the neutrality concept too is subject to the ultimate presupposition of a real possibility of a friend and enemy grouping. Should only neutrality prevail in the world, then not only war, but also neutrality would come to an end. The politics of avoiding war terminates, as does all politics, whenever the possibility of fighting disappears. What always matters is the possibility of the extreme case taking place, the real war, and the decision whether the situation has or has not arrived. That the extreme case appears to be an exception does not negate its decisive character, but confirms it all the more. To the extent that wars today have decreased in number and frequency, they have proportionately increased in ferocity. War is still today the most extreme possibility. One can say that the exceptional case has an especially decisive meaning, which exposes the core of the matter. For only in real combat is revealed the most extreme consequence of the political grouping of friend and enemy. From this most extreme possibility, human life derives its specifically political tension.
Yeah. So again, war is the extreme case, and by looking at war, we can see what the essence of the thing is, which, as I have repeated 3 times now, group violence. Where group violence exists in actuality or potentiality, politics exists. And war is merely that state of politics which is at the most extreme. It's the ultimate example of politics, and all the lesser states of conflict revolve around that, and political behavior is dictated by that ultimate possibility.
Quote, a world in which the possibility of war is utterly eliminated, a completely pacified globe, would be a world without the distinction of friend and enemy, and hence a world without politics. It is conceivable that such a world might contain many very interesting antitheses and contrasts, competitions and intrigues of every kind. But there would not be a meaningful antithesis whereby men could be required to sacrifice life, authorized to shed blood, and kill other human beings. For the definition of the political, it is here even irrelevant whether such a world without politics is desirable as an ideal situation. The phenomenon of the political can be understood only in the context of the ever present possibility of the friend and enemy grouping, regardless of the aspects which this possibility implies for morality, aesthetics, and economics. War, as the most extreme political means, discloses the possibility which underlies every political idea, namely the distinction of friend and enemy. This makes sense only as long as this distinction in mankind is actually present, or at least potentially possible. On the other hand, it would be senseless to wage war for purely religious, purely moral, purely juristic, or purely economic motives. The friend and enemy grouping, and therefore also war, cannot be derived from these specific antitheses of human endeavor. A war need not be something religious, nor something morally good, nor something lucrative. War today is in all likelihood none of these. The obvious point is mostly confused. This obvious point is mostly confused by the fact that religious, moral, and other antitheses can intensify to political ones and can bring about the decisive friend or enemy constellation. If, in fact, this occurs, then the relevant antithesis is no longer purely religious, moral, or economic, but political.
So in the 2000s, a popular new atheist talking point was that religion causes wars. And here we see Smith absolutely demolishing that idea. The moment a religious difference intensifies to the point where one religious group poses a existential threat to another one, you then have a political phenomenon going on, not a religious phenomenon. So it's a category error, even if it weren't empirically false. Even if you wanted to grant the premise, it's still a category error to say that religion causes wars.
That's a good point. I didn't think about that when I read this.
Me neither. I will go ahead and finish chapter 3, and then we will move on to perhaps other selections. Quote, the sole remaining question, then, is always whether such a friend and enemy grouping is really at hand, regardless of which human motives are sufficiently strong to have brought it about. Nothing can escape this logical conclusion of the political. If pacifist hostility toward war were so strong as to drive pacifists into a war against non-pacifists in a war against war, that would prove that pacifism truly possesses political energy, because it is sufficiently strong to group men according to friend and enemy. If, in fact, the will to abolish war is so strong that it no longer shuns war, then it has become a political motive, i.e., it affirms, even if only as an extreme possibility, war and even the reason for war. Presently, this appears to be a peculiar way of justifying wars. The war is then considered to constitute the absolute last war of humanity. Such a war is necessarily unusually intense and inhuman, because by transcending the limits of the political framework, it simultaneously degrades the enemy into moral and other categories and is forced to make him a monster that must not only be defeated, but also utterly destroyed. In other words, he is an enemy who no longer must be compelled to retreat into his borders only. The feasibility of such war is particularly illustrative of the fact that war as a real possibility is still present today, and this fact is crucial for the friend and enemy antithesis and for the recognition of politics. End quote. So that last bit's interesting. There's a lot of directions we could go there, but in terms of the particular inhumanity and intensity of the war, the fact that modern leftists or Jacobins or whatever you want to call them are fighting exactly such a war not only to force their enemy into a specific set of borders, but to chase them wherever they are and annihilate them wherever they are for the sake of eliminating whatever they call it, fascism, whiteness, whatever. This is the type of war being conducted against heritage Americans today. That's quite clear. All right, so that's it
fascinating
for.
That in this
Yeah,
one paragraph here, he basically derives the origin or the existence of a total war, or a war of unconditional surrender, a war of total destruction. These things that are very modern in concept, or perhaps very ancient once upon a time, but at least something very historically rare. It's very, very few people can actually explain this to any sufficient degree. This is another reason why I find Schmidt so important, is because you have achieved in modern American society what he's talking about here, where the enemy must be utterly destroyed in order for peace to exist, which for most political groups is one of the ends that they seek to achieve, peace to exist, which is why they're in such a conflict with these different groups. It is fascinating that that's how he derives the existence of this total war.
All right, I just have 6 screenshots I took. One of them is actually just a few pages on. Let's now bring up 38, uh, page 38. And this re-emphasizes some of what we have said, but it's important. Quote, the political can derive its energy from the most varied human endeavors, from the religious, economic, moral, and other antitheses. It does not describe its own substance, but only the intensity of an association or disassociation of human beings whose motives can be religious, national in the ethnic or cultural sense, economic, or another kind, and can affect at different times different coalitions and separations. The real friend enemy grouping is existentially so strong and decisive that the non political antithesis, at precisely the moment at which it becomes political, pushes aside and subordinates its hitherto purely religious, purely economic, purely cultural criteria and motives to the conditions and conclusions of the political situation at hand. In any event, that grouping is always political, which orients itself toward this most extreme possibility. This grouping is therefore always the decisive human grouping, the political entity. If such an entity exists at all, it is always the decisive entity, and it is sovereign in the sense that the decision about the critical situation, even if it is the exception, must always necessarily reside there. End quote. I have some things I could say there which sort of relate to the questions I was asking earlier, but particularly the point about how all of these other antitheses are subordinated under the political. This is actually why the group that is Heritage America and operating in defense of Heritage America isn't even necessarily all Heritage Americans or even necessarily all right wing, because various differences, ethnic, national, religious, economic, etc., are subordinated to the political, because the political grouping is the decisive grouping. And it's not a matter of opinion or private thought, but the reality of how the grouping actually breaks down, basically in terms of who is oriented against the other group when it comes to the possibility of actual conflict.
And more than not merely is it not a matter of opinion, it's not a matter of choice.
Exactly.
Right, and
That's I'm
something,
glad you said that. That's even more important, really.
and this is also interesting because it's descriptive of a lot of the origins of the Old Glory Club, which is the last constellation of American differences between groups was ideological in nature. However, the Old Glory Club has people holding to various ideologies, which in different points in history may have been in conflict with one another. However, something that we all just naturally recognized, uh, not needing to have read this by Schmidt, is just that our heritage, identity, nation, ethnicity, and whatnot else was being targeted by other groups, an enemy group, and that was just the state of things, and therefore the Old Glory Club exists. It's a group of American heritage and nation. This just naturally happened. What Schmidt is describing here is purely descriptive. It's very fascinating to see that in real time.
Yeah, on your Old Glory Club point, we draw from a wide variety of ideologies, religions, ethnic persuasions, at least within the broader Heritage American constellation of ethnicities. And we've talked about that at length in Albion Seed and other places. But if at this point you think your bonds are chosen, you haven't been paying attention.
Well, let's move on to page 46. Quote, as long as the state is a political entity, this requirement for internal peace compels it in critical situations to decide also upon the domestic enemy. Every state provides, therefore, some kind of formula for the declaration of the internal enemy. The declaration in the public law of the Greek republics and the Hostis declaration in the Roman public law are but two examples. Whether the form is sharper or milder explicit or implicit, whether ostracism, expulsion, proscription, or outlawry are provided for in special laws or in explicit or general descriptions. The aim is always the same, namely to declare an enemy. That, depending on the attitude of those who had been declared enemies of the state, is possibly the sign of civil war, i.e., the dissolution of the state as an organized political entity, internally peaceful, territorially enclosed, and impenetrable to aliens. The Civil War then decides the further fate of this entity. More so than for other states, this is particularly valid for a constitutional state, despite all the constitutional ties to which the state is bound. In a constitutional state, as Lorenz von Stein says, the Constitution is, quote, the expression of the societal order, the existence of society itself. As soon as it is attacked, the battle must then be waged outside the Constitution and the law, hence decided by the power of weapons, end quote. So there's a couple of interesting things there. I mean, one is the concept that the state always declares an internal enemy. There's always some sort of formula who the internal enemy is. In past times, this would be the communists, right? Now, obviously, that public declaration is quite different than what even actually happened when the state pronounced that, because we know that communists were not purged from the state. The actual formula for who is the enemy of the state during the Cold War was the same anti-fascist formula. That was the real internal enemy. We're getting into, I guess, some Machiavelli here. That was the real internal enemy as opposed to the proclaimed one. In any case, we then have this interesting bit at the end about the constitutional state and how once that societal order is attacked, whatever the Constitution is that declares what it is, then the battle is automatically outside of that Constitution by definition. That's really interesting because, I mean, this has obviously a lot of prescriptive possibilities to it in terms of, again, not to tie things too directly to our current time and place, but it simply has to be done in this case. The simple act of attacking a constitutional order necessarily means that the friend-enemy groupings must therefore wage the battle outside of Constitution and law.
There's also something else that would be very interesting to point out here too, and it's not that it was the most applicable at the time he was writing, but groups other than the state, perhaps smaller groups, do this as well, where they designate a specific internal enemy. There might be a real other enemy, internal, external enemies are recognized all the time. So you can see this naturally develop in any group. Where the group actually exists as a political entity.
And yes, I suppose in America today, the application here is the extent to which either side is strictly within the law is really the extent only to which the other side can threaten the existence of the other. For example, the executive order that I think President Trump signed today regarding the declaration of Antifa as a domestic terror organization, right? There isn't a category of domestic terrorist organization defined by existing law. So if certain actions basically would be prohibited by law, which is still partially in effect, I suppose. It's an interesting case where I feel like the quotation from Lorenz von Stein that's put here is a little too extreme or absolute, whereas clearly I guess we take the Constitution and law to more so reflect not the entire existing body of law as such, but specifically the original founding Constitution of the United States. That is clearly completely out of the window at this point in terms of tying a society together. But yeah, I don't know. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I mean it's a question of degree. Does one assassination upend the constitutional order and throw us into a state of nature? No, but as these acts mount one upon another, the constitutional order itself increasingly comes under attack, and at some point, the other side either surrenders or it moves on to the next level, which is the battlefield.
And I suppose the case for that would be the actual war between the states, where that was the point at which the constitutional order was completely uh, overthrown, and both sides had to settle their differences on the battlefield. So there's certainly a matter of degree here.
Yeah,
And
Anyway,
just
let's
just
move on to
uh,
49. Sure.
just because I could see the like if we had talked about all of this to like the typical meme crowd that likes to meme these ideas and water them down of any of their importance, just because there is a possibility of political action moving outside of a constitutional order does not itself negate any merits of a constitution. Nor does it. It doesn't necessarily. It's not an argument in favor or against it. It's a separate consideration. Perhaps is what I'm saying. This would be a poor argument to use against it, though I have seen people talk about it, that because there are actions taken outside of constitutional orders are therefore wrong, bad, unnatural, or whatever else, which it is not necessarily true. Perhaps something for the audience is in that line of thought.
Yes, all it's saying is that if the constitutional order is attacked in an absolute sense, which is, I suppose, what secession would be, right? That's the case where the war between the states happened. That's a absolute attack on the constitutional order because it is in a complete separation from it. That is the case where nothing takes place within that order anymore. But uh, anyway, let's move on to 49. I have, quote, for as long as a people exists in the political sphere, this people must, even if only in the most extreme case, and whether this point has been reached has to be decided by it, determine by itself the distinction of friend and enemy. Therein resides the essence of its political existence. When it no longer possesses the capacity or the will to make this distinction, it ceases to exist politically. If it permits this decision to be made by another, then it is no longer a politically free people and is absorbed into another political system. The justification of war does not reside in it being fought for ideals or norms of justice, but in its being fought against a real enemy. End quote. So I thought that was interesting because it brings into question whether or not the group of heritage Americans, to what degree they really exist as a political entity. I would say that heritage Americans are only scarcely exist as a political entity at this point. They are mostly absorbed within another political system. But the last 10 years, especially the last 10 days, have been, we've seen this group come to exist politically, wherein heritage Americans were not a political group 10 years ago, really. But they are, or if they were, there are orders of magnitude more a political group now than they were at that point, because especially if you look at the speeches given at the memorial event made for Charlie Kirk's passing, I think just yesterday, these speeches were given on Sunday. There were clear distinctions made about enemies there and in previous speeches. So I just thought that was interesting to observe the sort of the genesis of a political grouping where one previously didn't exist.
Well, and there's a different factor to consider there as well, which is that heritage Americans hadn't had such extreme force applied to them by an enemy group that does recognize them. Because before those events, a lot of people that objectively do fall into the category of heritage American or a descendant of the American nation, as we've talked about in our series here on American Spirits, a lot of the people in that category did not necessarily recognize themselves as being in that category. So the fact that they are now actively understanding they are in that category and because they are in that category, there is another category or group that wants them dead. I think that is a very big step that has actually created the Heritage American political group as a much more established force than it ever was beforehand.
Yeah, as Schmidt said earlier, the intensity of politics is driven by the intensity of association or disassociation of groups. And as we've seen Heritage Americans intensify their own association and intensify their disassociation with their enemies, the political character of the group has become clearer.
All right, let's move on to screenshot 51. Quote, were this distinction to vanish, then political life would vanish altogether. A people which exists in the political sphere cannot, despite entreating declarations to the contrary, escape from making this fateful distinction. If a part of the population declares that it no longer recognizes enemies, then, depending on the circumstance, it joins the side and aids them. Such a declaration does not abolish the reality of the friend and enemy distinction. Quite another question concerns citizens of a state who declare that they personally have no enemies. A private person has no political enemies. Such a declaration can at most say that he would like to place himself outside the political community to which he belongs, and continue to live as a private individual only. Furthermore, it would be a mistake to believe that a nation could eliminate the distinction of friend and enemy by declaring its friendship for the entire world. End quote.
No matter how ardently you might wish, you cannot just grill.
Oh, and perhaps those who are just grilling are joining the enemy side and aiding them, at least in more extreme cases. So this is really interesting because Schmidt, in some sense, eliminates the. Again, it's not a matter of choice, right? The friend and enemy distinction is not a choice. You cannot make the. That's what he's saying here. You don't have the choice to not be in a friend or enemy grouping, especially an enemy grouping if some other group declares you as an enemy. If you are a Heritage American, you're in an enemy grouping as defined by the left wing or Jacobin or whatever group you want to call them. That is quite clear. Obviously, the words get a little fuzzy. It's not necessarily every left winger and not necessarily every right winger on this side within that particular Heritage American grouping, but we are working with the terms we have, as has been the case with American spirits the entire time. In any case, it's not a choice. You do not choose your friend and enemy groupings, except to the extent that you make a decision for an entire collective, which the vast majority of people do not do that. Okay, just have two more quotations to bring up. Let's look at page 70. Quote, the negation of the political, which is inherent in every consistent individualism, leads necessarily to a political practice of distrust toward all conceivable political forces and forms of state and government, but never produces on its own a positive theory of state, government, and politics. As a result, there exists a liberal policy in the form of a polemical antithesis against state, church, or other institutions which restrict individual freedom. There exists a liberal policy of trade, church, and education, but absolutely no liberal politics, only a liberal critique of politics. End quote. So I thought that was just interesting to the extent that you have this idea of removing or negating politics as such, which is sort of what liberalism, as Schmidt is using it, particularly in his contemporary period, liberalism as the negation of politics necessarily means that there is no liberal politics, because the politics is the existence of a friend and enemy distinction, and to refuse to recognize friend and enemy and to sort of only look at debating and adversaries and competitors and this sort of thing necessarily leaves one outside of that antithesis distinction. And then finally, page 78. Quote, state and politics cannot be exterminated. The world will not become depoliticized with the aid of definitions and constructions, all of which circle the polarity of ethics and economics. Economic antagonisms can become political, and the fact that an economic power position could arise proves that the point of the political may be reached from the economic as well as from any other domain. The often quoted phrase by Walter Rathenau, namely that the destiny today is not politics but economics, originated in this context. It would be more exact to say that politics continues to remain the destiny, but what has occurred is that economics has become political and thereby the destiny. End quote.
Sorry, ANCAPs, but you will never abolish the state, bro, because politics is an emergent phenomenon of human nature. Where there are human beings in sufficient number, there will be politics.
Well, this is
And
why
the
I
reason
brought
I
up the definitions of state at the beginning, though, is because most ANCAPs work with a completely different concept of state than what Schmidt is working with.
Yeah.
And this same thing. So there's a very prominent scholar that did the same thing with a number of elite theorists, where they were talking about the same thing. The state cannot be separated from parts of society, kind of like how Schmidt is talking about. You can't eliminate state in politics, and then declared that the any sort of anarchist notion of abolishing the state is wrong. However, this applies a much more modern idea of what the state is backwards into what these people are saying.
Mm-hmm. Charlie, is it possible to bring up page 54?
Yeah, I know what you have planned here. It's obvious as soon as I read the first sentence, so I'll just read it for you. Quote, humanity as such cannot wage war because it has no enemy, at least not on this planet. End quote.
Indeed. Well, that cue godemperor.jpg. But what I actually wanted to talk about was the next paragraph, which, considering where and when Schmidt wrote it, this being 1929 Germany, I found to be absolutely chilling. Schmidt, in this part of the book, is discussing the League of Nations and the concept of outlawing war, which had gained a lot of currency in the 1920s. There were lots of world peace movements where people would sign petitions to outlaw war as an instrument of human policy, and Schmidt in this section of the book is demolishing it. But then he goes on to point out that the very impulse to invoke humanity as a concept to justify outlawing war will only lead to more atrocious and more intense wars. And he says here, the concept of humanity is an especially useful ideological instrument of imperialist expansion, and in its ethical humanitarian form, it is a specific vehicle of economic imperialism. Here one is reminded of a somewhat modified expression of Proudhon's, whoever invokes humanity wants to cheat. To confiscate the word humanity, to invoke and monopolize such a term, probably has certain incalculable effects, such as denying the enemy the quality of being human and declaring him to be an outlaw of humanity. And a war can thereby be driven to the most extreme inhumanity. And in those words, you can see prefigured Dresden, you can see prefigured all of the atrocities that were to come down 10, 15 years later. Schmidt saw it all in 1929.
32, but yes.
Not 32, thank you.
No, that's a very apt point you've made there. I also want to point out the main reason for the previous two things I had cited was that there's this tendency, we don't have to name them, but there are a number of people who sort of want to get rid of Schmidt, declare Schmidt as bad, whatever that means. But the point is that what Schmidt has done in this essay is define what the political is, not just in a way that no one has ever done before, but really no one has done before at all, except maybe arguably Aristotle. And that is what the friend-enemy distinction is. Politics is the existence of friend and enemy groupings. Friend and enemy groupings cannot be eliminated. The potential for friend and enemy groupings always exist. Where they happen to emerge is dependent on all of these other various forces of state and ideology, economics, morals, ethics, religion, etc. But no matter what one does or declares, or chooses, one cannot opt out of the existence of the friend and enemy distinction. It will always exist, and one will almost inevitably find oneself in one or the other groupings, even if it's only as a consequence of belonging to one state over another state. So I think with that, we can get to the super chats. Unless anyone has anything else we want to cite or comment on before I start reading them.
I think we've
Very
covered
good.
it.
All right, so super chats. We've got 10 Australian dollars from Dawn Browning, first in, and then 3 trophy emojis. I suppose she's
Shame
awarding.
upon Solid Snake. Shame and
Yes.
application.
I don't even see Solid Snake here, but I suppose we'll allow Mrs. Browning to award herself 3 trophies for.
To be fair, she's on the
Solid
other
Snake.
side of the international date line, so she has an advantage. It's tomorrow for her.
Very true. Then we have the Shadow Band, pretty usual contributor, for $15. Thank you very much. This sounds like a spicy one. I'll have to catch the replay, but thanks for the content. Yeah, well, I don't know. I wouldn't call it spicy, to be honest, but we'll see what you think.
Value-free analysis, and you're very welcome.
I was about to say, I feel like other people way outside of our spheres have made this more spicy than it actually is, just to hype it up. Perhaps
Yeah,
with
one thing
motives.
which struck me as I was reading it was just how blindingly obvious it all is when you sit down and take the trouble to think about it. That's why I said I was amazed to me that it took 2,500 years of political thought for someone to do this. But yeah, it's all there.
Yeah, we read really the 2 critical chapters, 2 and 3. You can go back and just read it for yourself on the stream if you want. We brought up I specifically brought up some topics and distinctions that might irritate people to demonstrate the point that what your personal feelings about all these different groups have nothing to do with what Schmidt is talking about. There's actually it's very straightforward. It's not spicy. That's kind of the point. This is not a spicy topic. It is a very value-free. It is a very objective view of what politics actually is. Anyway, from Paul W. Hall, pretty usual contributor, and I think D Space Denizen on occasion for $9.99. Thank you. Always appreciate these streams, even if I'm rarely able to watch them live. Keep up the good work, gentlemen. Well, we really appreciate those who offer some super chats for the stream, even when they're not catching us live. That's very generous. And then we've got Melon for $15. Thank you for this series. It has given much context to my Central PA chud life in terms of our roots. Well, please never stop chudding out, Melon. The chuds are true friends of Heritage Americans. One might even say they are the Heritage Americans.
The chud train rolls on through the power of anthracite coal.
And then finally we've got Bolero 393 for $50 for Charlie, an exemplar of a Heritage American, and for Ariana, who was under our protection. They both deserved better, and so do we.
Indeed.
Well, that's certainly true. If there was an exemplar
from
of Heritage Americans, it was Charlie Kirk.
Yes, a fine sentiment from a beloved and apparently well-heeled brother of the OGC.
Yes, and
well-heeled
to everyone that has donated, thank you very much. Just because this is a lot of effort that we put into the stream, so it's very encouraging to see that people are finding it valuable enough to donate. At least to me personally, I'm sure the rest of the panel shares the sentiment.
Indeed, we are not robots. We love encouragement, and we particularly love pecuniary encouragement.
Yes, it is quite a lot of work to do these. Fortunately, the concept of the political is a much easier read than most of the things we've gone over, mainly because it's short. But I think next week we'll be getting back into a longer work, which is The New Nation, A History of the United States During the Confederation by Merrill Jensen. So we'll be reading his second book on the Confederation period. We'll do half of it and then the other half the following week. And then perhaps 3 weeks from now, we might read some Rothbard, depending. It depends on whether or not we feel like doing that first, or whether or not we feel like reading Charles Beard's, what was the title, An Economic History of the U.S. Constitution or something like that. I don't have it in front of me, but those are two things we have planned following the next Jensen book. So we hope you have been enlightened thoroughly by this review of Carl Schmitt's The Concept of the Political. It's not difficult to grasp. It's quite straightforward. And if one simply reads and comprehends and views this objectively and without one's prior biases and opinions interfering with the interpretation here, I think Schmidt's formula is undeniable.
Indeed,
So,
I may never listen to James Lindsay again after this.
all right. Well, with that, thanks to the two of you for joining, especially Ryan, the permanent co-host of the stream, along with myself and Mr. Quinn, our frequent guest.
Schmittian
With that, we will
exception.